Okay, good afternoon. We begin the last session of this exhausting workshop with not exhausting but interesting presentation of Marina Gascón from the Universitat de Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Well, in November of last year, I was in Mexico. I met there Jordi Ferrer, who told me he was organizing this workshop and gently invited me to take part of it. I accepted blissfully, but when I knew after a month who were the speakers, I realized that how hastily I had accepted. What could I tell, I wonder, about scientific evidence in a so qualified expert forum? Maybe anything important or anything remarkable. In fact, I have learned very much in these two sessions, yesterday and this morning, and that's the reason because I want to thank you, Jordi, for the invitation, and to thank also all the rest of the speakers for its contribution. Well, recently I have been collaborating with some members of Spanish scientific police in a kind of fight against a legal project which aims to consider expert witnesses' report as a document. That means that experts don't have to declare at trial, and judges alone can interpret and assess the report. They surely, Michele, are not conscious about the dark days of forensic science that you referred this morning. We find that extremely dangerous, given the fact that most of times judges overestimate the probative value of the report's conclusions and interpret them in a wrong manner. Reconstructing the reasons of such overestimation and misinterpretation is the main objective of my paper here. Following this reconstruction, I also intend to point out some of the challenges faced by the use of scientific proof at trials. Before to start, I want to apologize for my very bad spoken English, which at this point must be very clear also. That's why I'm going to read my intervention in order not to introduce more confusion. Well, I want to spend a minute speaking about the great importance of scientific evidence in judicial proceedings. I will assume that scientific evidence has become the key in proving many facts that otherwise could not have been proven. However, the importance of scientific proofs in courtrooms had not been accompanied by a parallel process of cautious questioning. Quite the contrary. Precisely by the fact that these proofs are presented as scientific, and because in the majority of cases, at least here in Spain, come from official forensic labs, these proofs are surrounded by an aura of infallibility which has hindered any attempt of critical reflection, thus resulting both their validity and probative value having been taken for granted. It is also clear this conviction entails the risk that probative decisions supported by scientific evidence are considered unquestionable, hence discharging the judge from making special efforts to rationally ground his decision. In most of the cases, it is sufficient to allege the existence of scientific evidence pointed in the direction of the final decision. The infallible nature of this probative universe is based on two overestimations. On the one hand, its results are frequently overweighted or even regarded as infallible truths. And on the other hand, they are considered to say one thing when really they are saying another. The first is an epistemic overestimation, and the second is, so to say, a semantic overestimation. Why is the infallibility of scientific proof so strongly accepted? So why is scientific evidence not submitted to the same critical eye as non-scientific evidence? I will merely point out that the reason of such overestimation lies in the fact that scientific proof is believed to pass through epistemic and inferential bases different than those of the other proofs. Or more precisely, it is accepted that non-scientific proof is based on weakly grounded probabilistic laws, and therefore its results are fallible and they are to be expressed in terms of probability. However, scientific proof is argued to be based on universal laws which additionally are applied within a framework of scientific methodology, thus resulting in unquestionable results. In short, what it is held is that the knowledge obtained in the courtrooms is fragile, whereas that obtained in forensic labs is something quite different. Naturally, this is a mistaken conviction. Scientific proof in general is based on mainly probabilistic laws. Furthermore, its results must be interpreted using statistic tools. Therefore, it would be difficult to speak of objectivity, let alone infallibility, regarding conclusions made from them. Of course, it could be the case that the myth of infallibility of scientific evidence is linked to the great success of DNA proof, whose methodology is so developed and its accuracy so high that in practice it can be treated as if it were infallible. However, even if that were true, a more critical, reflective attitude should be adopted for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, the quality of scientific evidence depends on scientific validity of the method used to carry out the test. Secondly, the reliability attributed to scientific evidence also depends on technical quality. Let's remark here that on the one hand, we can speak of technical procedural correction, referring to the whole process leading from the discovery of the mark or element to be analyzed until its final analysis in the lab. On the other hand, we can also speak of technical scientific correction, referring to the correct handling of the test in the lab, that is, by skilled staff following adequate protocols. And lastly, we must remember that proofs are carried out by human beings, and human error can occur. It is worth noticing in this respect that over the last few years, many studies have highlighted cognitive risks in some scientific proofs, above all in those traditional ones which have a strong comparative component and depend greatly on expert judgment, such as fingerprinting. Negative consequences derive from the lack of serious reflection on the epistemic statute of scientific proofs. Perhaps the most blatant and adverse of them is the absence of control of their validity and reliability, thus permitting the entry of junk science into the proceeding. In addition, and relating to that, the myth of infallibility entails the risk of an awareness of miscarriages of justice, which may be committed as a result of grounding decision on junk science. And finally, this myth entails an additional risk, an adverse effect from a juridical point of view. Since the forensic report is assumed to be infallible, a judge cannot oppose it without strong reasons, thus being possible to say that it is the expert himself who tells the judge what to believe regarding the hypothesis under consideration. In that way, however, the role of fact-finder has shifted from the judges to the expert, and therefore a new system of proof grounded on the expert authority will have been adopted. Not only does the infallibility dogma of scientific evidence have to be reviewed, but also what I previously named the semantic overestimation. That is, the fact of considering results of the proof not only as being infallible, but also as saying something other than what they really are saying. What does it exactly mean? If scientific evidence has been idolized in legal proceedings, it is because it has been taken for granted that its results directly speak about what is to be proven. It is thought particularly that the result of a DNA test shows directly whether the analyzed sample derives from or does not derive from the same source as the compared sample. That the result of a ballistic proof directly shows whether the bullet came from or didn't come from the defendant's gun. That a voice comparison test tells us whether the voice of the caller alerting us to the whereabouts of the bomb belongs to or does not belong to the accused. In short, what it is thought is that the result of a scientific test speaks in the same terms in which the judge must speak. This belief represents what in forensic field is called individualization paradigm, which is settled in the belief that the result of a scientific test can link the analyzed mark to a specific source, excluding all others. However, things are not so. In fact, the individualization paradigm has come under harsh criticism from many scientists who have held that although it may be a simple and intuitive pattern of analysis, it is not acceptable. What it is held, in short, is that obtaining definitive proof of uniqueness is impossible. As a result, scientists have called for the need to interpret the result of the test not in identification terms, but in terms of likelihood. It is argued more specifically that there is no scientific grounding for an expert to hold categorically he has been able to identify a person or an object from the analysis carried out in the lab. This criticism, however, goes even further. There is neither scientific grounding that the expert report carries out a probabilistic assessment regarding the possibility of linking the examined mark to a person or an object. The outcome of a voice analysis, for example, doesn't demonstrate neither conclusively nor probably that the analyzed voice belongs to one person or another, but only gives data that, once interpreted with statistical tools, say things such as the following. It is X times more probable that this feature of the voice appears if the voice belongs to the accused than if it doesn't belong to him. In other words, scientific evidence speaks about probability of the data resulting from lab tests in face of the considered hypothesis, and not the opposite case. They don't speak about the probability of the considered hypothesis in face of the data. Therefore, the widespread custom of expressing the outcome of scientific tests in terms of categorical or even probabilistic identification of the hypothesis must be abandoned. A question arises then. If the individualization paradigm turns out not to be valid, how should the forensic expert assess evidence? The likelihood paradigm has been put forward to answer this question. Such a paradigm rests on the need to clearly distinguish between the three following questions that can be put once the pertinent test has been carried out and some data has been obtained. First of all, what does the data say about the hypothesis A versus hypothesis B? Secondly, what is to be believed from here, from the data? And three, what is to be done? In my opinion, that distinction constitutes a remarkable tool to reconstruct the interaction between the judicial process and a kind of proof, the scientific one, which is developed outside it. In fact, this paradigm allows us to draw a net delimitation of tasks between judges and experts. The first question shows the expert task. Interpretation of data as evidence is the main task of the expert in the trial, which involves interpreting what the outcome of the test says with respect to a hypothesis as opposed to the contrary. Let us recall that this interpretation ought to be done in terms of likelihood ratio. And it is of utmost importance that it be done correctly, since it is what has to be communicated to the judge. Once the data had been interpreted and expressed in the report, a second question must be answered. What is to be believed from the data? Or more precisely, what is to be believed from the data regarding the opposing hypothesis? This question expresses the task of assessing the hypothesis, and it is also important to remark that it must be done not only considering what the data says, but also what the other available evidence says. The assessment of the hypothesis is exclusively granted to the judge for at least two reasons. First of all, because it is the judge who has the institutional role to provide a legal decision in a controversial case. And secondly, because the free conviction principle requires the judge not to accept a fact until he is entirely convinced of it. And as a consequence, it requires the judge and not the expert to determine what is to be believed about the hypothesis under consideration from the evidence provided. In this regard, it should be noted that assigning the assessment task exclusively to the judges is not compatible with the individualization paradigm. Let's remember that according to the individualization paradigm, the expert report speaks in terms of mark M comes or does not come from the source S. But in such a case, it would have been the expert and not the judge who would have said what to believe about the hypothesis. And of course, as a consequence, important legal principles, such as the free conviction principle, are not observed. Lastly, the likelihood paradigm also points out the distinction between what is to be believed and what is to be done after a scientific test has been carried out. While what is to be believed about hypothesis is expressed as the probability of that hypothesis and coincides with the assessment of evidence, what is to be done, that is, making decision in light of that probability, states the issue of the standards of proof, that is, the issue of determining the degree of probability which a hypothesis must reach in order to be considered proven and act accordingly. To sum up, what is to be believed about the hypothesis depends on what the data says about it, as well as the rest of available evidence. What is to be done obviously depends on what is to be believed, but also on the normative framework in which the decision is to be adopted. Therefore, with the same belief, it is not the same to make a decision in civil proceedings than in criminal proceedings. And furthermore, In the last case, it is not the same to make a decision in legal inquiry proceedings than at the trial. Important challenges for accurate decision-making when scientific evidence is used derive from the likelihood paradigm. One of these concerns the assurance of the scientific validity of evidence admitted at trial. Another is related to the content and sense of the expert witness's report. And the last one deals with the way of assessing evidence when scientific data is provided. There's no doubt about the epistemic interest of assuring that expert testimony admitted at trial is grounded in reliable methodology, since that control aims to keep pseudoscience out of the decision-making field. How to achieve this goal is what differentiates legal systems. Two main positions may be adopted. On the one hand, it is possible to hold that no specific control of scientific admissibility is needed, along with the control of procedural admissibility, namely relevance and legality, so that all the relevant and legally gathered evidence ought to be admitted at the trial, postponing the question of its scientific validity and reliability until the moment of assessment. Ultimately, what is held is that if the evidence is not scientifically reliable, it will be deprived of any probative value when assessed by the judge. On the other hand, it's also possible to hold that there must be a control of scientific admissibility along with the control of procedural admissibility and different from the phase of assessing evidence. European countries in general have chosen the first position. Relevant and legally obtained scientific evidence enters the trial and is to be assessed by judges who confer it greater or lesser probative value depending, among others, on the reliability of the methodology used to obtain it. However, this option has some pitfalls. Firstly, we should mention a central conceptual issue which, in addition, has practical effects. This model does not distinguish between the phase of admitting expert evidence and the phase of assessing evidence, thus resulting that the scientific reliability of the proof is often confused with its probative value. It should be noticed, however, that admitting expert evidence does not presuppose ruling on its probative value, but purely on the possibility of being taken into consideration in order to decide the case. Both concepts, scientific reliability, admission, and probative value assessment, must be clearly distinguished. Secondly, there is also the problem that judges usually lack of the required scientific education to evaluate the validity of proofs. Therefore, leaving this task entirely to the judges without establishing any objective standard to give them guidance may well lead to either dismiss scientifically valid evidence or to give credit to some proofs which are merely pseudoscientific charlatanism and can prompt erroneous judicial decisions. That is why it seems to be more appropriate the alternative option, the one that claims to establish an objective standard of scientific admissibility of the proofs along with the examination of the procedural admissibility. This option has been adopted in the United States, where the Dauber test has settled there a standard of admissibility And in any case, I want to speak about the double test because you have speak a lot this morning, and also because I don't know properly well in which this test consists. But in any case, regardless which are the factors that compose the test, in my opinion, the important thing is that this kind of test or standards is having represented a call for judges to carefully examine a great deal of expertise that had not been questioned up until now, in that way leading the judges to recuperate their gatekeeper role. However, the Dover standard has not ended the controversy, given that its application assumes that judges are able to understand the scientific concepts which are needed in order to examine the validity of proofs, which is not always true. It is not surprising, therefore, that some have called for the need to provide the judges science education in the different fields of expertise, especially in the forthcoming areas. In any case, many questions remain open. For example, it is realistic to urge the judges to acquire scientific training in order to determine the reliability of scientific evidence. And it is not, however, more dangerous to leave that task entirely to the expert, who could have underlying interest in promoting certain techniques? Would it not be possible a system where judges decided, with the help of an independent, scientifically competent body? Besides the central issue of reliability of scientific evidence, there is another important question concerning the results of proofs to which, unfortunately, little attention has been paid. The question concerns more precisely the way in which the results of the test should be interpreted and expressed by forensic experts in order to avoid them being misunderstood or overweighted by judges. Let's remember that in accordance with the likelihood paradigm, the conclusions of the expert report ought to determine the meaning of the analytical data resulting from the test in the light of all the hypotheses, and not the opposite case. That is, the meaning of the hypothesis in the light of the analytical data resulting from the test. Understanding that the result of the test speak in the last terms is inherent to the individualization paradigm, which does not differentiate what the data says, an expert task, and what is to be believed from it, a judicial task, and leads to multiple misinterpretation and sometimes miscarriages of justice. Probably there is no magic formula to report the conclusions of the test, and probably there is no only one formula. In any case, it is clear that pronouncement, categorical or even merely probabilistic on the hypothesis, should be avoided. And on the contrary, pronouncements such as the following should be accepted. I repeat again, it is X times more probable that the compared fingerprints match if the doubted fingerprint belongs to the accused than if this doesn't belong to him. In this respect, forensic science faces an important challenge, that of adopting a standard of conclusions to give guidance to the labs in their work and at the same time to guarantee the use of common criteria. Assessing evidence is the core of probative decisions and consists of determining what is to be believed about the hypothesis under consideration. Therefore, assessing scientific evidence consists of attributing probative value to it with respect to the hypothesis describing the facts of the case. Two questions arise concerning the assessment: who is to assess and how to carry out the assessment. the answer to the first question may well appear as evident, and it is indeed. If it is the judge who has to provide a decision for the case, then it is also the judge who has to accomplish the previous task of stating the facts of the case. It is worth, however, insisting on that point, because it is one of the reasons for abandoning the individualization paradigm and adopting the likelihood one. Let's remember, in fact, that precisely by applying the individualization paradigm, many courts are acting as if it were the expert witness and not the judge who assesses evidence. The second and central question deals with how to carry out the assessment when scientific evidence has been provided. When there is no scientific evidence along with the scientific evidence, which is the common situation, determining what is to be believed about the hypothesis requires combining the probative value of both kinds of evidence. Naturally, this task is commonly accomplished by judges without any help from mathematics, subjectively, so to say. However, given the fact that the probative value of scientific evidence can be expressed in statistical terms, mathematical tools apt to carry out the assessment have been proposed over the last decades. One of the main attempts has been made by applying the Bayes theorem to juridical inferences based on subjective probabilities. The usefulness of the Bayesian formula lies on the fact that it permits combining statistical data about a certain event with non-statistical data, and the result of the combination expresses the assessment of the evidence. In reality, the Bayes theorem represents the impact that the inclusion of new statistical data, such as that resulting from scientific tests, has on the previous belief in the hypothesis that we intend to prove. However, the attempts of using the Bayes theorem to improve the accuracy of fact-finding are usually viewed as frustrating, since many flaws and problems have been identified. Some of the criticism are due to practical consideration. For example, they highlight the difficulty facing the judge to quantify its subjective previous assessment, the prior probability, or the risk which entails putting statistical tools in the hands of judges, which most of times are incomprehensible to them. Other criticism, however, question the epistemic validity of the model in the judicial field, as it leads to counterintuitive results and would doubtfully be compatible with fundamental juridical principles, such as the presumption of innocence. There's no doubt that this criticism ought to be considered seriously, very seriously. But in any case, the pitfalls of Bayesianism as a general model of assessing evidence doesn't impede it from being useful as a specific model for assessing evidence, for assessing scientific evidence, or more precisely, as a way to quantify the probative value of scientific evidence. If we admitted this usefulness, that would mean that two distinct concepts of probability can coexist in the assessment of evidence. On the one hand, the mathematical or statistical probability, which is used to quantify the probative value of scientific evidence, and on the other hand, the logical or inductive the epistemic, as Susan Hack said, probability, which can be used to express the conviction regarding the hypothesis under consideration in the light of all the available evidence, scientific or not. The standards of proof should be constructed upon the later. Thank you very much. Maybe I have a speaking.
No, perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe the wine, maybe the lunch, maybe me.
Everyone agrees with you. I'll kick off if I may. Okay,
Just a moment, please. Could you speak slowly?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Couple of small things first. There's a distinction that's sometimes important to draw between probability and probabilistic reasoning and statistics. In your paper, you use these slightly fungibly. They're not the same thing. So, I mean, I'll just illustrate this very specifically. When you mention the Sally Clark case.
Where? In which page?
Footnote 25, it's on page 16.
20?
20, yeah, footnote 25 on page 16.
Nota 25 en página 16.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Sally Clark's not an example of a mistake in statistics. It's a mistake in probabilistic reasoning, which was not statistical. It's a very clear case, because if the court and the relevant expert had regard to the statistics, they wouldn't have made a mistake. The mistake was a purely mathematical one, if you like, or if there is such a thing. The mistake was to assume independence between two events and then to use the multiplication rule to produce a probabilistic calculation of the probability of an event occurring. But that's not statistical. That's probabilistic.
Okay, maybe you...
And the reason it's such a good example is because there are actually statistics in evidence, data, empirical data, which falsified the probabilistic projection. So it's a very clear case. I mean, so I'm not just pointing this out as an example, I'm saying there's a more general point here that one does need to distinguish properly between statistics, which are to do with empirical data and counts, and probability, which may be applied to statistical information but need not be. Probability just could be calculation. So, for example, DNA evidence is mostly not about statistics. It's mostly about probability calculations, and they're totally different in that context. That's just a small point, because again, it's a point that statisticians understand very well, but forensic scientists mostly don't understand. So, insofar as these issues have become issues for forensic scientists, it's very important for people like us who are engaged in trying to explain all this to forensic scientists, make sure that we don't make mistakes about this, because if we do, they're going to be more prevalent amongst the forensic science community as well. So that's just, it's quite, I mean, I know it's a technical point, but I think it's quite an important.
In fact, most of the criticism comes not from purely forensic scientists, but from a statistician.
Sure,
yeah.
Right. So here's, I mean, there are some other bits that I'll do that privately. Here's the main question, I think. It's just a sort of, you say, $64,000 question, okay? You give the account that the weight of evidence should be expressed in likelihood ratios, right? That's your thesis.
That said, a statistician.
Well, okay, that's the thesis you put forward in this paper, that it should be in terms of...
I have assumed that.
Likelihood ratios, okay. Now, in England, experts are forbidden from using likelihood ratios in court.
Really?
Yeah. Now, I think that's correct. I think that's a correct judgment, and I can explain that if you want me to, but I'll just say for now I think that's correct. It's to do with the fact that juries make decisions in these cases. But set that aside. Even more recently, the English Court of Appeal has said that in particular kinds of cases, forensic scientists should never use likelihood ratios or Bayesian calculations. Now that's wrong, but I just mentioned that to you as an interesting development.
Yes, thank you.
In fact, I can give you the reference, but I've written something about this recently in Criminal Law Review. Anyway, here's the thing. Even supposing, on my view, that English law is right about these things, your paper is mainly addressed to professional decision makers, magistrates, judges in judge-only proceedings, right? So, but here's the question. You tell a judge in likelihood ratio terms, the evidence, the hypothesis of guilt is now 10 times more likely in light of the evidence than you thought it was originally. And that's what this evidence means, right?
Slowly.
Sorry. The evidence means that 10 more times. And the judge says, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a problem.
Well,
yeah, that's a problem.
Because unless there's an answer to that, it's not a good idea to give likelihood ratios.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, I know, but here there is a contradiction because on the one hand, a statistician said, and maybe they're right, that the correct way to interpret the result of the scientific test, of the most of the scientific test, is in terms of likelihood ratio. And also they say that there is so to say, more ordinary way to express the meaning of the likelihood ratio. But in fact, you are right, because then the problem comes how to transfer that to judge so as to be well interpreted. It's very difficult. We have had here in Spain a case in the last year, a famous case, because it was a case of terrorism. It was about the bombing in the Terminal T4 in Barajas Airport. And almost the only proof that was supporting the decision, the judicial decision of course, condenar, conviction decision, was a proof of comparison voices. The voice that did the call for only that. The official forensic labs made the test, made the comparison of voices, and they have been, in that case, extremely careful because it was a very important case. So they had been also very careful in expressing the conclusions of in the report in terms of likelihood ratio, and not in terms with numbers and no. In terms such as that, which I have read before. It is X, blah, 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 blah. But very well, I assure you, because I have been the report, very well expressed, very well expressed. When they went to the quorum to declare, to help the judges to interpret the report, so they have made a great effort to do a good interpretation, explaining them the error rate of the test, what does it mean, the likelihood, etc. Now you have to see the way in which the judges have interpreted the expert report reading the sentence. It's incomprehensible. They have not understand any word. I assure you, it's impossible to understand anything if you only read the sentence. So you are right. You are very right. It's a very big problem to communicate to people that have no science education, as is the case of judges, how to interpret an expert report that is written in terms of likelihood ratio. But I don't understand perfectly why they always misinterpreted that. Because if me, who has no scientific education, can more or less well, I think, to interpret a likelihood ratio. I don't understand why judges cannot do that. Sometimes I think that it's just a question of, I don't know, lazily, maybe, I don't know, or to rejecting any knowledge, any kind of knowledge that are not referring to law. I don't know, but it's not so difficult.
It may be that, and obviously I can't speak for individual judges and individual courts. Perhaps that's their view. They're just not interested in knowledge from outside jurisprudence, right? But my fear is that the argument goes, if they can't understand likelihood ratios, then we have to teach them likelihood ratios. And then we have to teach them Bayesian analysis of evidence. Then we have to reform the court system. Then we have to persuade the whole of society to have confidence in criminal verdicts arrived at through Bayesian reasoning. And when the whole world is a Bayesian, then this kind of analysis will work. And I fear that that's the argument, that's the way it goes. And if it is, if that's a well-founded fear, then the proposition that expressing evidence in terms of likelihood ratios is good is not satisfied. I'm not convinced that likelihood ratios are actually a good way of measuring evidential weight in forensic process, in judicial process. They might be good for other things.
But I don't understand why, if you decide to express the expert report in terms of likelihood ratio, you have to change all the system. I don't understand why. Why?
Well, why don't the judges understand it?
No, you have not said that. You have to check.
Because the argument, well, it's not my argument, it's the fear. The fear is that the implication of using likelihood ratios in judicial reasoning, in forensic reasoning, in adjudication, is that you have to become a Bayesian. You have to you have to have a prior probability, and you have to work that out in some way. Then you have to do the Bayes theorem calculation.
No, because no, it's not the task of the judge to do that. It's the task of forensic experts. So the question is that forensic scientists, when they communicate judges the result of the test, they have to communicate perfectly, and perfectly means in terms of likelihood ratio. That is what a statistician said, not me, which I'm not a statistician.
But what if that information is the equivalent of Ron's, what was the language that you used? Latin. What if it's the equivalent of Ron's Latin that you say, oh, it's perfect Latin, it's golden age Latin, there's nothing wrong with this Latin. if only the judges had better Latin, but it sounds like Bayesians are saying that. You can understand likelihood ratios without doing Bayes theorem. Correct. Yeah. Right. But here's the question, how do you combine a likelihood ratio expressed as a ratio, 10 times 20, whatever it is, with unquantified data? How do you do that?
Well, who says you have to, you have to combine it? Who says you have to quantify?
Well, the judge somehow has to integrate that evidence into an account of all the evidence.
Yeah.
How is that done? That's that.
We covered that yesterday.
No?
We covered it yesterday.
How?
So the likelihood ratio is telling you some information about the evidence, which I take to be your point. That's a different question from saying we're going to define the probative value as the likelihood ratio, quantify all the evidence included in the evidence.
This is not a theoretical question, it's a question of practical judging. How does the judge assimilate that information with other information in the case? It seems to me that the inability to do that is what leads judges to say, what does this mean?
Well, okay. You're giving me Bayesian nightmares. What a terrible world you just described. Oh my God. But okay, just quickly in response to that question, maybe it would be that one way in which someone who is not comfortable talking numbers all the time could understand such a thing would be You know, if somebody tells you that gives you a very low ratio, it's very rare, right? Or it's very unlikely that you're wrong, that this is the person. There are perfectly good expressions in natural language, not as precise, but they will convey the sense. If somebody tells me this blood type is extremely rare in the population, I have information I can integrate with non-numerical information quite easily. But okay, I actually have a genuine request. This is not in any way, shape or form an objection. Okay.
Can we just, sorry,
okay.
It's really important.
Excuse me, Paul, can we follow an order in the discussion?
Okay.
Because if not, it's a mess.
I mean, it's right up to the crux now. What you've just said there, Susan, is a reason for not giving likelihood ratios, but for giving verbal descriptors of what they mean. That's my point.
Okay, yes. Had I been able to present the part of the paper about the Collins case that I was not able to present, you would know that my suggestion would be, look, understand, supposing it had been true that there was only one couple in 12 million who met this description,
Collins.
right, of the Collinses, right, then a way to understand this as such couples are extremely rare in the relevant population. And that's perfectly easily integratable with other kinds of evidence. Like, numbers don't make it incomprehensible or unintegratable unless you're afraid of them, which may be the problem.
The important thing, in my opinion, the way in which I have interpreted all that, the important thing is not properly to declare the data in terms of likelihood ratio, but in which what they are saying deep down is that it's not correct that expert report express the conclusions in terms of probability of the hypothesis, because that is not what is said from the test. Mm-hmm. This is the main question. And they are saying also that that task, deep down also, is a task, a judge task. But the test said what said, which is expressed in terms of likelihood ratio or can be maybe transformed in other common language, more comprehensible for judges and for population in general. I agree with you. But the important thing is forbidden
to do that.
It's forbidden to do that because the test don't say that.
To do that in England?
No,
let's
be clear, your point's against Marina.
Yeah, that's right. You're not, it's not, yes,
Marina's
okay.
saying that the Bayesians forbid you to translate it into language descriptors. That's what English law requires, that it be translated into language descriptors.
In all cases, did you say there's some set that can speak in likelihood ratio? Or no set?
Not in court, no.
Okay, may I ask my genuine question? This is a genuine request for information from someone who doesn't know what's going on in this part of the world. What experience has the Spanish legal system or European legal systems more generally had with efforts to educate judges scientifically? What's been tried and what's been the result?
None.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
Michele.
Well, talking with some statisticians in these last years, I got the impression they are, many of them, not all, are victims of a sort of professional bias. No. Yes, that is, they are inclined to think that everything in the world can be expressed in percentages. And the social psychologists like Nisbet and Dross years ago showed that this is one of the most common fallacies in the common sense arguments. That is to quantify and to calculate what it is not quantified or quantifiable with the consequence that all the calculus is a fake. So if I start saying, well, I established that there is a probability of the 6% that I'll have a dessert this evening, okay, I establish a prior probability, and I can build upon that all kind of statistics and all kind of probabilities. Many ways forgetting that the starting point was not a real starting point, it was just an invention. So when we are talking of statistics in a serious way, we should take into account only the very small number of cases in which the statistical frequency has been empirically tested. And in the past, my objections against the use of Bayes' theorem in a judicial context was just this. Almost never we are able to quantify frequencies in specific cases. And discussing with an expert of probability calculus and statistics, he told me, Professor, your remarks are well-founded for now, but we expect that in the next 15 or 20 years we will be able to develop a calculus that will give an answer to your objections. This was an honest professor of probability calculus and of statistics. So where is the professional bias? The temptation to put into numbers everything and to think, to try to persuade others, including judges and juries, that this is the correct way of representing anything. I am extremely skeptical on that, because one thing is to talk of the DNA test that we know comes out with probability which is not statistical. Pay attention. Not all the times we find a 99%, we are finding a statistic. This is a probability, not statistical. No? Well, here we have numbers that have, when they have their own epistemic, so to say, justification, which is not statistic. Because the test of DNA doesn't say that in 99% of the cases studied there is such an outcome. It says that the comparison of the alleles gives such an outcome. They are completely different things. And that's why even the most stupid of the judges may apply correctly the effects of a DNA test, while he cannot be able to interpret the complicated statistical calculus, especially when the judge or the juror does not understand which is the connection between this calculus and the defects of the case. So, well, the professional bias is in thinking that when one puts anything in numbers, this is okay. In many cases, this is not okay. This is just an incorrect way of expressing anything. That's why I'm extremely skeptical with the statistics and the statisticians. One has to show me which is the empirical basis supporting a statistic. If there is no such empirical basis, we are talking of fantasies.
But Michele, I think that when you are speaking, when you critics the use of a statistic in the process, you are speaking as if we were speaking about using that as a general model of assessment. That's not the case that what I was speaking about. I was speaking about a very specific thing. That is, the result of some proofs, some scientific tests, are expressing, because the proofs are so, are expressing in terms of likelihood ratio. And that's so, because the proof consisting of that. So, what is the problem? The problem is that if the result are speaking in that terms, of course, terms that can be translated in other words, the judges are interpreting these results in other very different way. And why? Why are they interpreting in other way? Because it's more comfortable for them to interpret that the report is saying them what they have to decide. But what the forensic scientist said is that's not right.
Excuse me for interrupting you, because I don't know in the details of the case you are talking of. But which was the statistical basis in the case of voice comparison, saying there is such a probability that the conclusion is this? Which was the statistical empirical basis for saying that? If there was one, I'd like to know which was the statistical empirical confirmation
we
of...
Imagine what it would be. We don't know. In fact, but it's not that hard to imagine what it might be.
His point is the studies don't exist. The studies don't exist. This is
Don't exist.
well, that's what he's asking.
Yes, and therefore, how could the forensic experts say here there is a likelihood ratio of 90 or not or 20? That's why I suspect the professional bias of quantifying what we really could not quantify.
Voice analysis might be something that's an exception here, in that you can quantify the amount of match between voice patterns in a single case. So spectrographic analysis is standardly done in voice comparison. So although there aren't empirical studies of calibrations of error rates with particular experts.
That may be, but
I mean,
that 2009 report takes the voice analysis exactly as one of the example of subjective comparison,
Okay.
lacking of
There is a queue for
validation.
interventions.
So, well, we should open a seminar on that. But at this level, I think that all the doubts may be expressed, because, well, unless one has a very solid ground of statistical knowledge about that, that report says there is not a scientific valid basis for this kind of voice print analysis exactly, that there is no exact proper basis for that. Well, I don't know, I'm not a forensic expert, but if I read it on a probably reliable report about
But
those
Michele,
things.
if there are no scientific basis for holding that, let alone a scientific basis for interpret what judges are interpreting when they read the reports.
Yeah, but maybe the judges were wrong in doing what they did. Maybe. I'm not discussing this point of your presentation. I just cast it out about what the expert did when they made this text.
Mm-hmm.
This is my reservation, not on the judge. Then the judge understands nothing, but it happens also with the most obvious things. I'm not surprised by the judge, I'm surprised by the expert.
Michele, you grant the point.
Okay.
The subjectivity of a particular method of...
Can you use the microphone, please?
You grant the point that the subjectivity of the measurement, as alleged in the studies that you've been referring to,
Está parado.
is not incompatible with having a quite low error rate.
Probably it's not
In that
incompatible.
case, what's the force of calling it?
The
The fact that an instrument makes it, or that we make it, doesn't matter in the least, particularly if we happen to know that it exhibits a low error ratio.
But the problem from which we started was about statistics. So problem is, my question is, do we have empirically verified statistics about this kind of comparison or not? Seems not. If not, what is the statistical basis of the assessment? That's my question. If one says, yes, we have, and here we have the empirically verified statistics, okay, I'm wrong. But I'm waiting for the contrary proof.
Okay, there is a queue integrated by Ron, Andres, and me. And then we open to the other colleagues. Ron,
So
can you use the microphone for the registration, please?
every time I get called on, Larry just runs through like taking the battery out. And throwing it away. Is it, see, Larry, every single time. Come on, it's a Spanish microphone. We now have statistics for this information.
Yes.
Hume was wrong. There are reliable inductive inferences that we can draw here.
Okay, you can't.
I will just shout loudly. So, first of all, I am a professional anti-Bayesian. Point number one.
You are?
I'm a professional anti-Bayesian. Bayesian skeptic, yeah. But point number two is I have no professional biases. Zero professional biases. And I'm going to demonstrate this by saying I think this is a really good project. These are very powerful tools and very powerful ideas. And if they have not been explored systematically in Spain or anywhere else, they should be explored. And so your project is starting to explore them. And I think it's a really, really good thing. So I encourage this. I do want to caution you, though, that it is much more complicated than it appears. In a way, this goes back to Paul's question. You have a DNA test, and you get a likelihood ratio from a DNA test. Usually it's a random match probability. All right? And that's the likelihood ratio that is most discussed in the context of DNA. Now, the evidentiary effects of that don't exist independently of the other evidence in the case. So suppose I get a random, there's a spot of blood at the crime scene, right? And I take this blood and I do a DNA test, and it says the random match probability is 1 in 5 billion. All right? So does that increase my odds of, 5 billion, by 5 billion times of the probability of guilt? No, it doesn't. If there is any other evidence in the case that puts the defendant at the scene, do you understand?
No.
If there's other evidence, this is an important point for you. And maybe we should do this in Spanish. If I could speak Spanish, I would. But you have to deal with what are called the dependency relationships. Somebody should translate this.
Tienes que considerar también otros elementos de prueba porque el éxito, el resultado del test de DNA no está en sí mismo suficiente para demostrar.
Okay, thank you, Michele.
You're modeling this as though the statistical evidence were independent of all the other evidence in the case. That can be the case.
Yeah.
This is what's called a cold hit in a DNA database. Cold hit in a DNA database, the DNA evidence is all there is. Do you understand?
Maybe.
¿Cómo pones juntas las pruebas?
Yeah. Yes.
¿Cómo las relacionas con otras pruebas?
I know.
¿Cómo haces la relación conjunta de pruebas que son estadísticas con otras?
You want to make that. So, now I'll go back to my point. If there is eyewitness testimony placing the defendant at the scene, okay, that's relevant to whether that is his drop of blood. So the DNA test of that blood is in a dependent relationship to the other evidence in the case. So you can't just take a likelihood ratio based upon the DNA test. All of us get sophisticated about DNA tests. I mean, you can't if you like, but it just makes the problem worse. So you can't just go from the likelihood ratio.
Yeah, I know.
Because all that evidence is dependent. It's not dependent upon it. It's in a dependency relationship with all the other evidence.
To the other evidence,
Right.
yeah.
That's where, that, in my opinion, that's the prior probability, but that's the primary flaw in the Bayesian arguments about juridical proof. We never have that data. We don't know what the dependency relationships are. If we did, it would be fine.
Yeah.
But it's a conceptual point for you. You can't model these as independent of all the other evidence in the case because they're not independent. They're interlocked.
Yeah.
And it could be the case, it could be true, that DNA evidence that says this is the blood from that person has zero probative value. It simply replicates, repeats other evidence in the case.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know the problem that we have facing. Yeah, but thank you.
Andrés.
I want to go back to the idea that perhaps numerical values, the results of tests, can be expressed qualitatively to the judge and so on. There are several studies in medicine where many words that doctors use to express likelihoods and to express probabilities are given to the general public. Words like probable, likely, rare, suspicious, certain, and they ask people to assign numbers to those words. And the results vary widely. I mean, these studies have been replicated in Japan, in the States, in several countries. So if you just tell someone that this result is suspicious or that it's almost certain or something like that, there's a very high chance that the judge is just going to assign some random number to that result. In other words, that if you say that the result is likely, the judge will not be able to really give a correct, the right weight to that evidence, because likely can be interpreted in very different ways depending on which judge you're talking to. So there's a big risk in making those transitions between qualitative and quantitative vocabularies. I think that that should be taken into account. If I don't know what would the reasons in England for eliminating the numerical vocabulary.
Let's be very clear.
Yeah.
The numerical vocabulary is not eliminated. Likelihood ratios are.
Only.
Yes.
Okay.
Because likelihood ratios are, in most people's view, fundamentally unintelligible to lay people. If you say that something is 10 times more than something else, but you don't have a number for the prior probability, you don't have a number for the something else, it's just unintelligible. You're absolutely right that there's a big problem in moving between likelihood ratios and verbal descriptors for the strength of those likelihood ratios. But that is what the Forensic Science Service does in the UK systematically. And the reason it does it is because the problems that you've just correctly identified are not as severe as the first problem of giving the court just a naked, crude likelihood ratio, because that is regarded as unintelligible. And therefore, whatever problems there are in terms of coming up with verbal descriptors for likelihood ratios, they cannot be as great as giving the court or the juror, whoever it is, whoever the decision maker is, a measure of evidence, of the strength of evidence, of the weight of evidence, which is correct in Bayesian terms, it's formally correct, but useless in the context for which it's intended. So it's a question of the latter is just less bad than the former.
Slightly less bad.
How do you measure it? Well, infinitely less bad, because the first is unintelligible.
I have a question about your proposal in order to restrict to apply only for the scientific evidence the Bayesianism reasoning, Bayesian reasoning. First of all, I am absolutely, I agree absolutely with Ron, with his intervention, and also in his professional anti-Bayesianism. but I think that there is another problem. Your proposal, Marina, presupposes that we can establish a sharply differentiation between scientific evidence and not scientific evidence. Scientific evidence, for the scientific evidence, we can apply the Bayesian reasoning, and for non-scientific evidence, we cannot apply Bayesian reasoning. But then we need sharply difference between these two types of evidence, and I think there is no sharp difference between these two types of evidence. There is no demarcation between science and not science. Then there is no demarcation between scientific evidence and not scientific evidence, and then we cannot make a proposal between different types of reasoning for this different type of evidence. I think this is a conceptual problem for this, if we cannot distinguish sharply between these two types of evidence. And if you presupposes that we can, the question is how?
Thank you. First of all, I don't make in this paper no proposal of Bayesianism, as I think it is clear. I have made just a modest exam about the misinterpretation of the result of proofs, of scientific proofs. No Bayesian proposal. In fact, I think when I refer to the Bayesian formula, I refer to it as one of the most successful mathematical tools with which scientific community has dealt with this topic. No proposal of Bayesianism. Second, I think there is a difference between scientific evidence and non-scientific evidence, even though I don't make a perfect definition between them. But I'm sure that between the expert, the expert testimony, for example, saying about a comparison voice analysis, and a normal witness about who has seen something in the Shin crime, there is a big and enormous difference. and enormous. I think there is no...
Of degree, not categorical.
No, not degree. Very different. The expert witnesses is reporting about the result of a proof that is based in a scientific method. Another different thing is the grounding of this, the scientific grounding of this method. But of course, he pretends to report the results of a scientific test, and a witness is just a person that said something.
Okay, in the public, Carmen.
Marina, I was wondering, why do you focus on admissibility? Because, for example, in American system, it makes sense because, well, for them are very important maybe. But for us, the admissibility decision is not quite, it's quite different from American system. And it's almost the same with the law-keeping role. So why do you focus on both of them?
In fact, Michele Tarufo this morning spoke about this topic. In fact, in general, in our countries, there is no special place for admissibility control. But I have spoken about that just because I think it's worthy to wonder if there is better this situation, or on the contrary, it would be better to have a kind of a specific control. Why? Because at least in Spain, the way in which the things works is so. Admissibility, even if not with that word, but which we can refer as or call as admissibility, is considered by judges when assessing evidence. Are the judges that who wonder if the kind of test which provide the data, the scientific evidence, is scientifically grounded or scientifically reliable or not, but as a part of assessment. And I only said that it is worthy to ask, to wonder if this is the best situation, or maybe it would be better a kind of objective standard in the terms of Dauber, even though I don't know perfectly Dauber, of course, but some kind of standard that give some guidance to judges, and especially that tell judges they had been very careful in order to admit evidence. Just that is a way to point out an important question.
Nicola and Giovanni.
Michele.
Yeah, I have a clarification question, and then a second point which is open also to Paul Roberts, because I'd like to try to comprehend the relation between statistical evidence and probability. Yeah? The first point is related with two passages of your text where the first is page 17, where you say assessing evidence is the core of probative decisions and process of determining what is to be believed about the hypothesis under consideration. And the second is at page 2021, the last line of page 20. On the other hand, the logical or inductive
21.
20 and 21.
The last part
okay.
Where you say that, on the other hand, the logical inductive probability, which can be used to express the conviction regarding the hypothesis under consideration, etc., etc. Now, I have only a comprehension, a clarification question. What do you mean with when you say determining what is to be believed and to to express the conviction regarding under consideration. Do you mean?
And to express the conviction where?
Yes, you
okay.
use the words believe and conviction. Do you refer to
the same thing?
Yeah, but to the psychological process or to the degree of warrant?
Well, I in fact don't make any distinction here because it's not the main topic here. So I have not focused my attention on the task of assessment so as to distinguish perfectly every level of analysis that you can do. I only...
But there are two different things, the degree of belief and the degree of warrant.
Yeah, but here, in my opinion, here, for the purpose of here, is not relevant. Not... No?
The second point I was discussing with Diego Papayani. We asked if it isn't possible to draw inferences assuming statistical evidence and other premises. If it is not possible to draw inferences about the probability, assuming this statistical evidence, plus another premise to draw an inference about probability. If there isn't a relation between the two things.
You're asking me or?
Well, the two.
That's a question for me.
Well, the two.
No, I it's a point on which I have no informed or serious answer, so I don't answer.
You can form a personal probability projection on any data of any kind. So it makes no difference what kind of data it is for those purposes.
Well, so I probably don't understand the point you was making before when you discussed the difference between statistical evidence and
it's really about the basic concept. Statistics are empirical data. They are counts of things in the world. Probability is not that. It's calculus. So when we say, as we do with DNA evidence, that there's only 1 in a billion chance that that there will be an adventitious match between a crime scene profile and an entirely innocent person, the chances of that are 1 in a billion, given the current assumptions about the way the database works. That's not statistic. Nobody's gone out and collected that. That's a projection of probability, right? So there are different ways of managing uncertainty. And sometimes it doesn't really matter. You can use the language in a loose way and people will say statistics when they mean probability and vice versa. And a year ago, I would have done it myself, except I've spent a year working with statisticians and now I don't. Because every time I did it, it's kind of like, training a dog. You slap it when it does something wrong, slap me. Slap, Paul, no, that's not statistics, that's probability. I think I've got it now. They've beaten it into me, right? But
so can I just say, I don't accept this. I think we have to be skeptical or cautious about this. The DNA we're talking about is premised upon a relative frequency account of the data. If a relative frequency account of the data is not statistics, then I don't know what statistics is.
Oh, he can't.
No. Well, he said a 1 in a trillion.
It's very important.
Right. He said 1 in a trillion is probability, not statistics. The 1 in a trillion is derived from a relative frequency account of the data. If that's not statistic, I don't know what it is.
The relative frequencies relate to the question of population genetics and whether you should have different databases for different ethnic groups.
Well,
that's the bit that is statistic. that's not how you arrive primarily at the 1 in a billion, which is to do with the chance, just the probabilistic chances of getting an adventitious match between a certain number of alleles. That's a purely probabilistic calculation. And that's another good example of the difference between the two. There's statistical counts on the one hand, which are statistics, and they're empirical, and there's pure probabilistic.
So walk through the path from a statistic to a probability and tell me how one gets transmuted into another.
Well, it depends what, I mean, if you're talking about...
Your example, I just you say that all of a sudden you say that 1 in a billion isn't statistics anymore, but it looks to me like it's derived from a relative frequency account all the way down. A relative frequency account of the replication of alleles, a relative frequency account of the replication of those alleles in the population. They're what are called subpopulation problems. Does this allele appear in the same proportion in somebody in Chicago as in Spain?
Excuse me. Can I interject a question? A billion of what? When you say 1 upon a billion, no? The billion is a billion of persons living in Australia, or is a billion of possible combinations on the DNA double helix? Because these are completely different references.
It's the second thing. It's the second thing.
It's the second.
It's the second thing. That's why probabilistic.
That's why it's not statistics.
That's why you will get to the position very soon, probably, thank you, already have done, where the chances of an adventitious match are greater than the number of people have ever lived, or something like that. That can't possibly be a statistic. Logically, that's an empirical matter. It has to be a probabilistic calculation. Put it another way, sometimes the probability is less than 1 human being, but there is no such thing as less than 1 human being in empirical reality. But let's go back to the very example, which is why it's important. The Sally Clark case, right? In the question is, slightly related to what I'm going to talk about later. Did the mother kill the 2 babies in their cots, or did they die of, we say, SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, or cot death? Was it a natural, unexplained death? And there was a study that had been done on the incidence of multiple SIDS in the same family, so families that had suffered more than one sudden infant death. That study was statistical. It actually went out and did the empirical analysis, the sort that Michele was calling for with regard to forensic sciences generally. And it came up with some very interesting results, like the fact that multiple SIDS in a single family are quite rare, but they happen not infrequently. So, I don't know, there might be 20 cases a year or something where you get multiple SIDS. There was actually a figure in the data that would be, and they are empirical statistical data, right? Right. Now, if the expert had testified to that, there would have been no problem. But he didn't. He ignored the statistics and did a probability calculation. He took from the statistical information the incidence of 1 SID, which was 1 in 8,000 and something.